Now we'll move on to discuss the bones of the skull, including the cranial bones and the facial bones. The skull is made up of 22 bones and is divided into two major divisions: bones of the cranium and bones of the face. The 8 bones in the cranium protect the brain, and the 14 facial bones protect the entrance to the digestive system and the respiratory system. Some of these bones in the skull are separated by special immovable joints known as sutures. These images show the locations of the sutures of the skull. The suture separate the bones of the cranium. The 5 major sutures of the skull are the lambdoid suture, the sagittal suture, the coronal suture, the squamous suture, and the frontonasal suture. Each suture joins 2 or more bones firmly together with dense fibrous connective tissue. The frontonasal suture joins the frontal bone and the maxilla. The squamous suture joins the parietal bone and the temporal bone. Across the top of the skull is the coronal suture, which joins the frontal bone and the parietal bone. The lambdoid suture joins the occipital bone at the back of the skull with the 2 parietal bones, and the sagittal suture, running across the top, joins the 2 parietal bones. This horizontal section shows the bones in the cranial vault. At the anterior is the frontal bone and the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone is a butterfly-shaped bone that spans across the horizontal section. It has a cell trachea, which underneath contains the pituitary gland. At the posterior end is the occipital bone, in which is the foramen magnum. The cranial vault or fossa houses the brain and changes in size as the skull grows. The foramen magnum is an opening in the occipital bone through which the medulla oblongata of the spinal cord passes. This is the route through which the central nervous system exits the skull and becomes the spinal cord. Now let's review the bones of the cranium. At the back and base of the skull is the occipital bone, which contains the foramen magnum. The 2 parietal bones also contribute to the back of the upper part of the skull. The skull articulates with and sits on the first cervical vertebrae, and this articulation takes place through the occipital condyles. The nuchal lines on the back of the occipital bone is where the muscles and ligaments that stabilize the articulation between the skull and the first cervical vertebrae C1 attach. The foramen magnum in the occipital bone is the passageway for the medulla oblongata. Let's discuss the bones of the cranium in more detail. The frontal bone makes up the forehead and the roof of the orbits of the eyes. The vertical portion of the bone forms the forehead, and the orbital or horizontal portion of the bone forms the orbital roof. The frontal bone is a thick bone that rests on 2 parietal bones. The lacrimal fossa is where the lacrimal gland resides. The frontal bone contains air cells on the bottom of the anterior surface behind the eye sockets. The skull contains 2 parietal bones. These make up the superior and lateral surfaces of the skull. On the outside of the parietal bones are ridges, known as the superior and inferior temporal lines. This is where the temporalis muscle attaches, and these muscles elevate the mandible during chewing. The temporal bones make up the lateral and contribute to the inferior wall of the skull. These bones articulate with the zygomatic bone to make the arches of the cheeks. The temporal bone, along with the mandible, make the temporomandibular joint, and this facilitates jaw movement. The temporal bones have what's known as a tympanic portion, which surrounds the external auditory canal. The jugular vein, facial nerve, and the internal carotid artery pass through this bone. Within the tympanic cavity is the end of the auditory tube. Also in this cavity are the three ossicles or middle ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes. These bones transmit sound to the eardrum during the hearing process. The next bone of the cranium we'll discuss is the ethmoid bone. This image depicts the ethmoid bone in its posterior view. Its makeup includes a labyrinth and a superior nasal concha, superior meatus, and an uncinate process. There's a middle nasal concha and a perpendicular plate. The ethmoid bone is an irregular bone that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. It's located at the roof of the nose between the two orbits. The ethmoid bone has three major parts: the cribriform plate, the ethmoidal labyrinth, and the perpendicular plate. The cribriform plate contains passageways for the olfactory nerves and an attachment for the special membrane known as the falx cerebri, which stabilizes the position of the brain. The labyrinth contains nasal concha, which are filled with air cells, and these communicate with the air cells of the frontal bone and the nasal cavities. The perpendicular plate forms part of the nasal septum. It also contains the olfactory receptors in an epithelial layer in its inferior surfaces. The sphenoid bone is a bat or butterfly-shaped bone that spans across the floor of the skull and articulates with all the other cranial bones. This bone strengthens the sides of the skull. It has an enclosure known as the sella turcica, which contains the pituitary gland. The optic groove passes through this bone and it contains the optic nerve. The pterygoid processes of the sphenoid are plates that serve as attachment points for muscles that move the lower jaw and the soft palate. The other bones that make up the skull are the facial bones. There are a total of 14 facial bones, 2 pairs each of the maxilla, palatine, nasal, inferior nasal conchae, zygomatic, and lacrimal bones. This group also includes the vomer and the mandible bone, and the facial bones form the anterior and part of the lower portion of the human skull. The following is a clinical note on craniostenosis. Craniostenosis is a distortion of the skull typically caused by the premature closures of one or more of the sutures in the skull. As one of the sutures closes early and does not permit expansion as the brain grows, the other sutures compensate, and this leads to distortion of the skull. The skull will form a predictable shape depending on which suture closed prematurely. For example, if the sagittal suture closes prematurely, a long, narrow head will develop. The next facial bones we'll discuss are the maxilla and palatine bones. The 2 maxilla bones are visible in this anterior view of the skull. These are fused together along the palatal fissure, and they form the roof of the mouth, the floor and lateral wall of the nasal antrum, and the wall of each eye orbit. The maxilla bones form the upper jaw, although they do not articulate with the mandible, the lower jaw. And these bones make up the largest sinuses in the skull and most of the roof of the hard palate. In this inferior view, the palatine bones are visible. These bones articulate with the maxilla bones, form the posterior portion of the hard palate. These L-shaped bones also articulate with the vomer, sphenoid, ethmoid, and inferior nasal conchae bones. The palatine bones form a small portion of the posterior floor of the orbit. The inferior nasal conchae bones and the nasal bones. At the midline of the face are the paired nasal bones, and they form the bridge of the nose. These bones articulate with the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, and the 2 maxilla bones. The cartilage attached to the inferior edge supports the flexible portion of the nose, and this extends to the nasal openings. The inferior nasal concave bones are similar in shape to a portion of the ethmoid. Each scroll-shaped bone is located on the side of the nasal septum, and the unique shape of these bones warms and moistens the incoming air that swirls against them. Two other pairs of facial bones are the zygomatic bone and the lacrimal bone. The zygomatic bone is visible in this anterior view, and it makes up the arches of the cheek. These bones, which are shown in yellow, articulate with the maxilla, temporal bone, sphenoid, and frontal bone. A foramen on the anterior surface of each bone houses a sensory nerve that innervates the cheek. These bones also contribute to the inferior wall of the eye orbit. The lacrimal bone is also identified on this anterior view. These bones are the smallest bones in the skull and are located in the anterior of the medial wall of the eye orbit. The lacrimal bones articulate with the frontal bone, maxilla bone, and the ethmoid bone. And the upper part of the lacrimal fossa contains the lacrimal gland, and the lower part the nasolacrimal duct. The two facial bones that are not paired are the vomer and mandible. The vomer contributes to the nasal septum at the inferior portion, and it's visible in this anterior view of the skull. This bone is located on the floor of the nasal cavity and articulates with the sphenoid, ethmoid, palatine, and maxillary bones. The anterior border of the vomer is grooved for the inferior margin of the septal cartilage of the nose. The mandible is also known as the lower jaw, and it has a structure that contains a variety of surfaces. The mandible bone is shown in the image on the right. There's a head and a coronoid process which sweeps down through an angle towards the front of the bone or the mental protuberance. Each ramus of the mandible meets the body at the angle of the mandible, and in addition to supporting the teeth in the mandibular body, the head articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint. The temporalis muscle inserts in the mandible at the coronoid processes, and the alveolar part of the mandible is a thickened portion that contains the roots of the teeth. The orbits of the eye are made up of a combination of 7 different bones. These bones are shown in this anterior view of the skull, and the bones are the frontal bone, the zygomatic bone, the sphenoid bone, the maxilla bone, the ethmoid bone, and the lacrimal bone. Contained within the orbit are the eyeball, the ocular musculature, nerves, and blood vessels. And there are a number of nerves that pass through the superior orbital fissure, including the superior division of the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the abducens nerve, and the sympathetic fibers from the cavernous plexus. The hyoid bone is associated with the skull, and it's located, as you can see in this anterior view, above the thyroid cartilage. The hyoid bone has a greater and lesser horn as part of its structure, and this horse-shaped bone is located at the anterior midline of the neck, although it does not articulate with any other bone in the body. From within the stylohyoid ligaments, it serves as an attachment point and base for a number of muscles involved in moving the tongue and the larynx. The greater horns of the hyoid bone support the larynx, and the lesser horns are connected to the stylohyoid ligaments.